Can you share your screen? Let's see if that works.
Okay. Let's see that. Okay, you see my screen?
It's still, yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. I'm happy to have you here. This is introduction to CSS, and in this class, we are going to go through some of the basics so that you can get started with using CSS to style your web pages. So let me give you a little bit of intro on what CSS is all about. I imagine that most of you already know this. I'll try and keep this class as much beginner friendly as possible. I know some of you are already you are a 10x software front-end engineer. Well, kudos to you. But this class is for beginners, and we're going to talk about the basics of CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and in a moment I will explain just what that means. But the idea is CSS is responsible for how your pages look. They are responsible for responsible for the appearance of your web pages. It's not responsible for content, right? So I have a slide here. It says describes how HTML elements are to be displayed on a web page, right? So the HTML provides the content for a web page, while CSS is only concerned with the appearance of that content. So the content doesn't come from CSS, it comes from your HTML file, right? So CSS files are saved to the extension CSS. So let me explain more about this second point. The content you created inside your HTML, the how you want that content to look, right? The appearance, that's where CSS comes in. Let's take a look at let's real quick tab so I demonstrate how CSS actually works. This is a page, Stack Overflow. This, if you're a software dev, this should be one of your most favorite, one of your favorite sites, right? Um, so I'm going to do something real quick. Okay, so I'm going to disable the styles for this page. Let me enable it again so you take a good look. This is a Stack Overflow. Obviously, you see the top featured questions, you see custom filters that I set up. You see a lot of content. You see a sidebar by the right, a the fixed to the top of the screen, a lot of things going on, right? I even have dark mode set up, right? But if I disable that, you see the content is still there, right? That's all. This is the content you have from your HTML. All this that you're looking at, a lot of it content inside HTML file, but it's no longer styled, right? So it's in the CSS file that you specify how you want that content to look. In the case of Stack Overflow, specify that it looks just like this, right? So let's move on. Um, there are three ways of adding CSS to your HTML document. You can add them using external CSS. It means the CSS is in a separate file, separate from your HTML. You have a separate file .css for it. And then it could be internal. Internal means the CSS will be in the HTML document, but it will be inside the style tag, a special tag known as style tag, right? It will contain all the CSS. That's when you are styling your HTML using internal CSS, or it could also be inline. By inline, it means the CSS is included directly inside the HTML tags as an attribute. Let me try and demonstrate the three of these real quick. So I have a live server set up here. I have a small folder that contains a HTML file, index.html, CSS file, index.css, right? Very straightforward. And this is a VS Code. I'm going to assume that all of you are familiar with it. So I'm using Go Live. You do not have to use Go Live. Sorry, I'm using Live Server, and you do not have to use it. If you don't have it, it's not all that necessary to do what I'm doing now. I merely use it so that when I make my changes, they update automatically without me having to refresh my browser. So that's the only real difference in using Live Server. So let me turn on my server. So you see, we've got an empty screen. I don't have much of content. So let me try and demonstrate. Let me add a few elements. I hope you can see my screen. I think it's zoomed in. So let's go. Div. First div. And okay, let's have another div. Why not? Second div. Okay, that's not it. All right, cool. So let's look at the means that I pointed out earlier. So give me a second. Okay, so let's first let's start from the last, inline CSS. All right, so let's include some inline styles. If you save this and we go to our browser over here, you see first div, second div, right? It's not styled. You only see some text, right? No real styling, right? I have not done anything inside the CSS file. Okay, so let me include some styling. Later, I will explain what I'm doing. Just go along with me for now. Style, background color, let's say yellow. For the first div, and for the second div, let's say style, background color, light blue, something. All right, so you can see our two divs. The styles are being applied, right? Okay, so let me get rid of this, the two inline styles. Like I said earlier, what I just did now, these are inline styles because I'm adding the styles through an attribute, a style attribute, right? Which is part of the element I'm styling. So for each element I want to style, if I want to go with inline styles, I have to add a style attribute, and then I'll add my CSS inside as the value of that attribute. Okay, so let's try the next means of doing this. Let me save this, get rid of the styles. Okay, now the styles have gone away again. So the next one is internal CSS. All right, so let me give this. Go with me, I will explain all this later if you do not know what I'm doing. Let's say this one is first. Here is a style tag, different from the style attributes. Okay. For the style tag, you have you just create a tag like this, and then you put all your CSS within the start and the end tags of that element, right? So let's go. The first, let me include some CSS there. Background color, yellow. Second, background color, light blue, I think. All right, so when you go back to our page, you see that all those styles are back. But this time I didn't do it using inline styles, right? I did internal styles, and it's called internal because it is still inside the HTML file. We are not using a separate file for our CSS. We are using the same file we'll use for our HTML, the index.html, to also style the web page. So let's do the last one, that is external. To use an external style, what you do is you import using a link tag like this, and then you include it. You do this rel style sheet. I'll come back to all this later. href. So I'm not going to talk about addressing and relative addresses. I imagine you would cover it. It's outside the scope of this class. But for what we're trying to do here, index.css is in the same folder as the HTML. So we can just go ahead and just type index.css, right? Okay, so cool. So once we save it, any styles that appear inside this index.css will work in our HTML because we're importing it, right? Every every style that is inside this CSS would apply to the HTML because it's being imported, right? So let me try and do this again. First, background color on yellow, and second, background color red, blue. So you see that the styles are still working, and they are not even the styles are not even inside the HTML file. I'm getting them from its own separate file. So these are the three ways you can include CSS in a document. And what's more, let me there are merits and drawbacks to using each of any of these, right? A lot of people, myself included, prefer external CSS, right? Because it is considered more flexible. By more flexible, I mean, you see, as I have an index.html and I've imported the styles inside index.css, it is possible to have dozens of HTML files that import the same index.css. What it means is that the styling inside that index.css will affect all of my files, all my HTML, which is considered a good thing, because most of the websites that you design, you're going to have situations where you have maybe a landing page or a home page, then maybe about us page, contact us page, etc. Like that Stack Overflow page that we visited, I've reopened it. You see that this is a page, this is their landing page, stackoverflow.com. And this is a profile page where you see your profile. But you notice that there are still a lot of similar styling. Like this the top menu, the menu at the top is still there. We still have this sidebar, we still have the dark theme, right? It's still using the same font. So there are still a lot of similarities, despite the fact there are two different pages. And if you say you want to open, let's say tags, is another web page on the site, but it's still using similar styling. So that's why it's considered helpful to make use of external CSS, so that you can actually write all your CSS in one file and import it in many. Imagine if you were using internal CSS and you style a website, right, the way you want, and then later on, maybe let's say some months later, your boss tells you or your manager tells you, okay, we've changed our minds. The theme that we were using was red. We don't like red anymore, right? Use green instead, right? Green is the best. You have to go into every single one of those HTML file and edit all the styles there. Since you are not importing from one place, all your styles are in many files. So you have to go there and keep changing. Where you have background color equals red, you have to change it to background color equals green, and you have to make that change, possibly depending on how big the website is. You make that change dozens of times, right? Or even hundreds, who knows, right? But if you import using external CSS, you actually get to make do some of your styling in one place and import it all over the site. So that's why external CSS is considered better. So let's move on. So let's talk about CSS syntax. If you look at this picture here, you see I have a selector, something known as a selector. It says H1, and then we have a declaration, right? At times it's known as a rule. A declaration or a rule is made up of a property and a value. Let's go back to some of my CSS so that I explain this in depth. This, you see, we have two groups. Let me separate them so it's clear. So this is synonymous with what you just saw, right? This is the selector. The hashtag and first is a selector, right? And then you have the opening brace and the ending brace. That means any rules I put inside here will affect this selector. All right. So we have the first rule says background color yellow. You could have as many rules as possible. Don't mind that I have only one here. You could go color red, right? And if I save it, it applies to the first div. The color is now red and the background color is yellow, right? So this is a CSS selector, and this is a rule, a CSS rule, where you have a property, background color in this case, and then you have a value. So using rules such as this, you can actually describe how you want your website to look, right? So that's basically that for that. So you CSS syntax is always this: a property and a value, a property and a value. Each property and a value usually ends with a semicolon, right? If you go back to my CSS, you see that I include semicolons at the end of each. So I go property colon, then value semicolon. So CSS is actually very straightforward, right? If you treat it as straightforward, you realize it's actually quite simple, and it's fun, right? So so once again, you have inside this for this second selector here, you have background color, then colon, then you have a value for background color. In this case, it is light blue, and then you have a semicolon ending that rule. So very basic. All right, so let's talk about selectors now. So selectors are used to find HTML elements that you want to style, right? If you will not need selectors if you were using inline styling, right, where you can use a style tag like this and style the elements, right? You don't need a selector. But for any other type of styling, you need a selector because you need a means of referring to that element, right? So, for example, I gave this an ID of first. ID equals first. That means in my CSS, anytime the browser sees me styling anything called that has ID of first, he knows I am talking about this element here, this first div that I have highlighted. So that's why it's known as a selector. So there are several types of selectors. I'm going to rush through them real quick because we have a lot of ground to cover today. So we have simple selectors based on name, ID, or class. By name, I mean div here. Let me quickly demonstrate. You can actually style elements by using the name of that element. Like you have div, or you have img for image, or you have span, just the names of elements, even body, since body is an element on its own, right? You have A for anchor, P for paragraph, etc. So you can style select elements using the name of that element. For example, let me go div, background color, light blue. So it means for every div in this website, in this web page, give them a background color of light blue. So let me save that and let's see. All right. So as you can see, all my divs, respective of which ID or which, all of them have this. I am using this as a selector. So another selector you can use is ID, and I've already done that, or class. Let me please explain the difference between an ID and a class. So an ID, there can only an ID is like is a unique identifier for that element. So two elements on a web page cannot share the same ID, right? Is wrong. If I give an element a particular ID, there's not supposed to be another element on that web page having that same ID. However, classes are different. Classes could be shared. So I could give, it would be wrong for me to do something like this because we already have an ID called first. It's wrong to have another one with that same first. If I want a selector to target multiple elements, I could use the name of that element, which is in this case div. Let me do a quick demonstration of what I mean. So this will be third div. This will be fourth div. So okay, let me give this a class of first. Give this one a class of first. Remember, like I said, multiple elements can share the same class. It is fine, right? And let's give this one a class of second. And let's do the same for this class second. Okay, cool. All right. Notice because I gave let me space this out so that I will introduce a few rules that might look a little confusing if you're a beginner, but that's fine. Okay, so you see I have 4 different divs and all of them share the same styling because I give them all of them the same padding, the same margin, the same background color. So all of them look very similar apart from the content inside, right? But if I decide I want only the odd number divs to be light blue, for the non-odd number divs to be yellow instead, I could take away this styling here and put it in a class because I've used classes to distinguish these I've used classes to distinguish these divs. So let's see how we can do that. But first, background color light blue, and the second background color yellow. Okay, so as you can see, because they have different classes, I was able to style them differently based on their class, using the class as a selector. All right, so that's about the first type of selectors. Now, most of the selectors you're going to use are going to be the first of this group. So I'm just going to rush through this. If you need further information about the subject of selectors, there is this fantastic website known as W3 Schools. A lot of the content I'm using for this class was sourced from there heavily, if you ask me, and is a really helpful website. I'm not going to cover a lot about this subject on this class because this is a 45 minutes class. So you refer to W3 Schools if you have any questions, or you can of course reach out to me. My name is Johnson. My username on Slack is Grandmaster. I could help you out. Right. So combinated selectors, let's talk about those. When you select elements based on specific relationship, I'm not going to dwell on this very much, but let me say there is a class called fourth, and it has an inner class called child of fourth something. Okay, so child of fourth because it's a child of the fourth, the class the one I gave fourth. So let's also call it okay. And this will be fourth. All right, so if I want to style this child of fourth, I could do something like, first off, I could just style it by saying using child of fourth as a selector, but I could also use a combination. Let me demonstrate. let's say I have dot fourth. All right, so I could do something like this, dot, or even div. What I just did now, I'm saying any div that is a child of fourth, that is inside of fourth, you should style it this way. This div will not affect all the other divs. You know, we have like 5 different divs right now on this site, but this, whatever I do here, like, okay, let me say background color black and color white, right? These styles that I just put there, these rules will not affect any other div except the div that's inside a class, a div with a class of fourth, and that is this one. So it's only the div, this div that will get affected. So let's see. So you can see that the only div that has a black background and a white text color is fourth child, right? So that's about combination. You could select elements based on their relationship. You can target children elements. You can also target sibling elements. We are not going to talk about that because we don't have time to cover all of that. You can also target pseudo class selectors as well as pseudo elements. We are not going to dwell on most of these, as well as attributes. That is, you could select an element based on its attributes. For example, if you have, let's say an input, see what I mean by selecting an element because of using its attributes. Let's say type email, right? So I could actually select this element by saying something like this. Let's say, let me remove this fourth input and you go this. Right, and you can see my input now has color of white and background color of black because I use this to target any input. This is basically saying find me any input that has a type attribute. I could be more specific and say find me any input that has any type attribute with value email. It will still select this because this is an email field, right? So so that's basically that. So let's just move on. Okay, so let's talk more about selectors. When you use this asterisk, you can use asterisk to refer to uh, all elements basically being styled. For example, I could hide all the elements, or I could, yeah, basically I could say display none. It will mean all the elements will vanish, right? Because this selects all elements, okay? Right, so you can use this to select all elements. At times, there are some things that you want to apply to all elements. Usually, that's not the case, but at times you want to do that. Okay, an example is when you want to. Okay, let me not. That's actually outside the scope of this class. Let's just move on. So selectors can be grouped, separated by commas. Let me explain that quickly. At times, when you have similar classes, you see a situation where you have first and then you have second. First background color light blue, second background color light blue, and you have a situation like this. You see that you are it's like you are repeating yourself, right? So you are typing the same background color light blue for 2 different selectors. If you have a situation like this, you can actually combine them and say first you can remove this and just use one single block, go first, second, right? It will be the same thing as if you typed this, as if you typed different blocks for them, right? So you can group them using commas. When you have a selector and then comma another selector, you actually can group those selectors and style whatever styling comes between these braces will apply to both all the elements that are targeted by these two selectors, right? So let's see this. Okay, let me get rid of this. All right, so you see first and second now have backgrounds of light blue. See, first, second, first. So these three elements will have background color of light blue because I grouped that in my styling. All right, so let's move on. So basic specificity rules. Selectors cascade. I don't have a lot of time left, but selectors cascade. What it means is that there's this rule of whichever one comes last, that one would overwrite whatever came before it. Imagine some of you already are familiar with CSS cascading and specificity. You all know that CSS actually gets its name from its ability to cascade. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. Let's say I have this here. First, background color light blue. And then for some reason, I decide to do the same thing, background color, but instead of light blue, I used green, right? By CSS rules, this first light blue background color is light blue that I entered there will be completely ignored, right? It will be overwritten by this one. So cascading is what CSS does when there are two styles that conflict, right? Because one is saying background color should be light blue, another one is saying it should be green instead, and they are targeting the same selector, right? So you see that green takes precedence instead of light blue because green came later, so it overrides whatever came first. So, and another thing you should keep in mind is that the rules that are overriding most, what I have here, default styles, element name, classes, IDs, inline styles, and important. I'm talking about styles that, as in the level of weight, right? In case there is a conflict, how the browser resolves such conflicts, like which one the browser will deem is more important, right? So there are such things as default styles. Those ones are the least important. Then styles using element name. Those ones are more important than default styles, but they are not as important as classes. Let me demonstrate. If I have a class that says, let me say div, let me get rid of this conflict. Business. Let me say something like display block, div display. No. Let me get rid of all this. Okay. So if you look at this, you see that you can still see the elements. Let me remove this for a second. You can't see the elements because of this. You have a style that says any div no div should be displayed, right? Now let me put this here. Despite the fact that the rule that says that no div should be displayed comes later, it will still be overridden by this one because this one uses a style to target these elements. So these elements will be affected by the class more than it will be affected by its name. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to have to do display block. So you can see that the element is still showing, right? But if I remove this, the elements, or if I take this back down to div, the element doesn't show again, right? Because this will overwrite it. Okay. Let me give it an ID so that I can demonstrate how all these things. First, let me call it first ID. Okay, cool. So we have a class overriding an element name, like we have in our slide here. We see element name comes, then classes can override it. But what can override classes is ID. So let me now hide it using, let me give this one the ID. ID is styled using hash symbol, just like classes are selected using dots, right? So first ID, I believe this is correct. Okay, so now you see the element has gone away because this one has overridden the class, right? Even if I move this one up to come first, it will still override the class anyway because it is considered more specific, right? You see, it's still overriding the class, right? So that's how it works. If I want the class to override, there is this should I say command or keyword known as important, like like the exclamation symbol and then important. This means is a way of saying that the browser should ignore the specificity rules and just apply this one, right? And if I do this, it means this one is now overriding, despite the fact that it's a class. It actually is overriding an ID because I used the important flag to kind of elevate its specificity. It's not usually advised to do this, and it's best to actually use other means to override, maybe assign an ID instead and whatever. But we're not going to go very deeply into that. Let's talk about CSS colors and units and text. So colors can be specified in four main ways. We have keywords, like I think most of us have seen those keywords where you go, let's say background color, red. Red is a keyword, right? So if you look, you see red is, so red is a keyword and it is used to apply our rules, right? But you can specify the color red in other ways. You can go RGB, let's say 25500. It's still the same red, right? So let's look at there are four main ways. Number one is keywords like red, blue, purple, orange. I think there are 140 of keywords that CSS supports. If you want to see all of those, I am not going to recite it for you. You have to go on W3 schools or go online. Right? There are a lot of resources that will show you the list of colors. I think even if you use a good text code editor, you can actually get drop down of colors. If you look, I'm getting auto suggestions: light blue, lavender, khaki, Indian red, indigo, etc. Gainsborough, ghost white, gold, gray, green, yellow, right? You can also use RGB. That's what I did earlier, where you specify, is like you're calling a function, for those of you that are familiar with JavaScript, RGB, and then you put this comma, parenthesis, and inside there you specify the first color you specify will be for the arrow. RGB, of course, means red, green, blue. So the first number you specify will be for the red. So let me give red 0 and give green 0 also, and give blue 100. Okay. You see that it will now be very blue. So that's you can specify using RGB. You can also specify using hex. By hex I mean you usually start a hex value with the hash sign, and then you enter a number. For those of you that are not familiar with hexadecimal values, it's basically what I just entered, but in hexadecimal. You enter the first two will be a value for a hexadecimal value for red, then hexadecimal value for green, and the same for blue, right? So let me pick your random number. Okay, G is not. So this is a valid hexadecimal symbol, and hexadecimal number, I mean, and it's published, as you can see. Now, if you use editors such as VS Code, you don't have to memorize anything. I actually don't recommend you memorize anything about CSS. You do not have to. Understanding it is much better than memorizing it, because it's really, really wide, very powerful tool. I do not know all of it myself. Okay, so I don't suggest you memorize it. If you hover over a color, you see this drop down where you could pick a color you want, right? And you could pick the transparency of that color, right? So VS Code gives you that option. So that's a good thing. So you don't actually have to memorize this. The last one in this list is HSL. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's another way of specifying a color. So colors can be applied to text, and I think I've done that. You can also apply it to background using the background color property. Let me use color, and let's say something red. Let me give it a big font so that it stands out. Font size 40 pixels, and let's say padding 10 pixels. All right. So you can see I've specified the color for the text, that's the red, and the color for the background, that's this green. Let me put a keyword there so that's easier to green yellow, for example. So you can see green yellow background and red text. So that's what we've got going. So let's so that's that for colors. You can also apply it to borders. There is no border now, but we'll come back to borders in a moment. But let me give it a border anyway. 2 pixels. I guess red is a good border. So you see, it now has a border, and I gave it a color. It might not be obvious. Let me make the border a little thicker. So you can see we have a very nice thick border. That's what's color again, brown. And so you can specify colors for the elements background for its text color, which is red, and also for its border. You can also do the same from what I have here for its shadow also, for shadows also, but we'll not go into that right now. So let's talk about units. Distance or length units include pixel, millimeter, inches, point, em, rem, vh, vw, and percentage. The others. So let me try and explain each one briefly. I am really out of time now. Okay, so each you probably have seen px before. I think I even have it here. Px stands for pixel, right? And millimeter, in inches, pt point. Em is it depends on, is known as a relative unit, because it depends on the font size of that particular element. Just like REM depends on the font size of the root element, and VH depends on the size of the screen. Sorry, the VH means viewport height, so it depends on the height of the screen's viewport, and VW depends on the width of the screen's viewport. Let me demonstrate that real quick. Let's say this element, let's not call it first, let's call it parent. Yes, parent, and its first div. So I want it to take the entire width of the page. I'm going to have to do this real quick because the browser, at times we have to fight. But then 0, margin 0. So at times the browser introduces its own paddings and margins. So I want to override all of that. So let it still have a background color of green yellow, but I want the height to be 100 VW. So I was saying VW means the, oh sorry, VH. VH means viewport height, right? It means the entire height of the screen, so to speak. So it means this element will be as tall as the screen. It will fill up the screen in terms of the height. Now let me do the same for the width. 100 VW, not VH this time, VW, which is the entire width of the screen. So that means this parent element will actually fill up the screen. So let's see. So you can see this right here. The screen is filled up entirely with the parent element. Let me drop a few elements inside this. Okay, let's just run through this. The unit can be omitted for 0 values. That is, if you want to specify 0 pixels, you can still say 0 pixels, fine, but you do not have to. You just put 0 there. It's you can omit a unit if it is 0. You can omit the unit if the value you are entering is 0, right? So degrees used for transform, for specifying degrees. That's DE. Okay, so let's a few of the styles that you can apply to text include text align, right? For example, let me put this first div back here. You notice that the text is at the extreme left, right? So text align allows you to specify how the text will align, basically. Whether if you've used any word processing tool before, you know that you could align it to the left, to the right, to the center. You could use justify, right? So those are the common values of this rule. These are property text align. So let's see, text align center. So you can see that is now my first div is now in the center. Let me increase the size a little bit. 40 pixels. Okay, so it's now in the center of the screen, which is cool. So another way to style text is text transform. You use it to, in case you want the text to be uppercase, lowercase, and the rest, text transform. You see, the values I have here in the drop down. Capitalize. Capitalize means the first letter will be capital. Lowercase, uppercase. Let me go for uppercase. And you see that first div is now capital, despite the fact that in my HTML is not capital, right? So you can use CSS to actually specify the casing of your text. Another way to style CSS, to style text, is text decoration. With text decoration, you can be underlined. Text so it's now underlined. So you could also some more common ways of styling text is font font size is obviously the size of the font. The higher this number that you assign to it, the bigger the font will appear. Okay. I think that should be self-explanatory. So font family has to do with how the font looks. Again, if you have used any word processing documents, including these Google slides that I'm on here, you can see it's possible to pick a font family. Like now, I'm using Lato, but I could use maybe Comforter, right? And you see that the font actually changed. So it's the same for font family. Font family. So you see a list of fonts that you could select, and they will be applied. You see that the font of this first div has changed. We use font weight is also if you want to be bold. That already. So that's that. Let's talk finally about the CSS box model, after which I will entertain your questions if you have any. So the box model, don't let the name scare you. It's not that complicated. CSS sees each element as a box, even if it doesn't look like it. For example, this is a box. Every element you see is a box. And to expand on that further, each HTML element is a box, and it consists of 4 parts. One is the content, right? Let me get rid of this underline. Okay, so you see that. Let me place 2 elements. Give me a moment. Let's create 2 divs. Let's call this first and call this one second. And the first one will let's give it text of first, so it's easy to recognize it. All right, so you see 2 elements, first and second. So each element in CSS is actually considered a box, and it has 4 parts. The first part is content, where you could have the text content, the image content, anything that it contains, the children of that particular element. That's what is known as its content. And then we have padding, right? So before I talk about padding, let me talk about border. Each element has a border, and there is explanatory, like the part where the element ends, basically, and the environment of that element starts. And so each element has a border, and the padding is the space between that border and the content. Okay, and let me demonstrate real quick by giving up both of these borders. So you know by now that if I put border here, border, let's say 3 pixels, solid, black, something else. Okay. So if from what I said earlier, I can target the 2 children of the parents. You know, from our HTML, the parent has 2 children, and they are both divs. So I could say something like dot parent space div. This is a way of saying all the children of parents that are divs, that this should apply to them. I want all of them to have a border. Let's say 3 pixels, 5 pixels, solid. All right, so you can see that if you look closely, you see that the border between 2 of them look thick. It's actually the 2 borders, the border of first and border of second combined, right? So you notice that there is a padding. Sorry, right now there is actually no padding. but padding will be the space between the contents, that is this first, and this red background, this red border, sorry. So let me give you the padding so that you could easily understand what I mean. Padding. Pixels. All right. You see my highlighter first. So this is where first ends, and this, what you see around first, is actually the padding, right? So there is now a space between content and border. So that border, that space between content and border is the padding, right? Now the margin is the space between the border and the rest of the page. That is that element environment. Let me explain. You have the border of first and the border of second. There is no space between them, right? Because neither of them have any kind of margin. But let me give first here, but first margin. Let me say margin bottom 30 pixels. So you can see there is now some space between the border of the first element and whatever comes next, right? So let me try and explain this with a question. I guess you didn't know you could explain this with questions. All right. Let me give both of them a common border. So margin 15 pixels. Okay. Well, let me increase that a little. 15 is fine. So the space. So ask yourself this question: what's the space between this element here, the content of first and the content of second? And look at the CSS again. Each of them has a padding of 10 pixels, and they have a border that is 10 pixels, 5 pixels thick, and a margin that is 15 pixels. So this border is 5 pixels, and then the padding, the space between the first and the border is what, 10 pixels. So the distance between here and here, actually, you could just add it up. You have 10 pixels here, you have 5 and you have 15, then you have another 5 and then 10. So that is I don't know, some number. But basically, this is to help you understand how the box model works. You basically have elements that have content, then they have a border, and then they have padding, which is the space between the border and the content that they have. And then they have a margin, which is the space between that border and their environment. So that's basically that. I don't think there is any more to talk about regarding the CSS box model. So I hope this was a little bit clear for the beginners. So I think I will take questions now. Maybe a few questions if there are any. So, but in the meantime, I want to really encourage you guys to try and play with this, right? CSS is really powerful, but it's a language, and you don't learn a language by watching a tutorial video. You learn a language by playing with it, by absorbing it, by being around that language, so to speak. So play around with CSS, create pages, tag them, play around with the properties and values so that you could see how um, so that you could see how So you can see how the styles work for yourself. Okay, so I don't think are there any questions before I move on? Okay, cool. So I thanks you all for attending. So peace out. Later. Good evening.